So let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. First item is scan probes on port 53 TCP. That's DNS. I'm showing a year's worth of data here because I wanted to kind of lay out the situation. And as you can see, for a good portion of the last year, this kind of probing activity has been going on that's been causing lots of alerts. Pretty much most of the probes here are from a single source in China. It's been going pretty consistently. I didn't go back and check the entire year to see if it was the same source. It may have changed over time, but certainly in the recent past, it's been consistently from a single source. That source is also probing on some other ports. Port 21, that's FTP, port 22, SSH, port 23, Telnet, port 25, SMTP, so mail transfer protocol, port 80, that's web, port 443, encrypted web, 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, and last but not least 8080, which is generally used for proxying activity. So clearly this is going around and looking for a number of different types of servers. A lot of them suggest perhaps getting data, remote access, or unauthorized access into systems. It's not exactly clear what the motive for DNS, except perhaps to be able to capture zone transfers and get an idea of what the landscape is from a DNS point of view. But in any case, if you witness this type of activity, you might want to block this activity because it does not appear to be up to something good. Next item here is scan probes on port 143 TCP. That's IMAP. That's Internet Mail Access Protocol. This actually, mostly the dark blocks that you see further to the right, we're looking at 60 days worth of data here, is attributable to a U.S. university. So I consider that to be innocuous. This activity from this university is pretty well known, relatively well documented, and so it's not something that I feel you need to be terribly concerned about. There are other ports that this university has been probing as well. I didn't go through the trouble to document it or share them all here, but there are a number of other sets of probing activity that you may witness associated with a U.S. university. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of interesting. I think last week we talked about IMAP-S on 993, and a couple weeks ago we talked about POP3, and it's looking at the shapes of the graph, and I know it's from the same organization that's doing the scanning, but it's very similar patterns, and it seems to be going through the email protocols here now.
Yeah, so they've been basically, I think, looking for, I think it's just even looking more for than just the services. My impression is they're looking for very easy to access platforms, but I'm speculating a little bit on that topic. Next item here is scan probes on port 8009 TCP. That's Apache JServe protocol. John, are you familiar with this particular protocol?
A little bit. I don't remember the exact details of what happens on 8009.
I looked up the description of it. I wasn't particularly familiar with it because I'm not a web developer, but it says that it can proxy inbound requests from a web server through an application server that sits behind the web server. So it's basically a reverse proxy kind of application. Most of the probes here, again, from a single address in China, not the same as the previous one, and that same address is also probing on port 5800, that's virtual network computing, 5900, which is also associated with virtual network computing, 6379, I wasn't familiar with this one previously, it's Redis serialization protocol, which Redis is an application that provides caching things. We're going to look at that a little more closely. Port 8090, which is an alternate port for HTTP, and then 11211, which is basically a memory caching protocol as well, which I can't say that I understand fully. But
yeah, Redis is also a memory caching
database,
right?
Right. It's basically in-memory database application. So what I thought would be useful is that, particularly because I wasn't particularly familiar with one, is take a little closer look at that one. Again, we're looking at 90 days of activity in this case, and you can see that probing activity has been going on fairly regularly as well. Pretty much focused, associated with this same source of activity. Redis is a NoSQL database which stores everything in RAM as a key value pairs, and by default it's a text-oriented interface that's reachable on port 6379 without authentication. And actually this quote is from a website of somebody that was actually doing a little bit of Redis hacking activity and demonstrating how easy it was to get into it. And so just a snapshot of the website where this guy goes into some relatively detailed documentation. He was actually trying to hack Redis via HTTP requests. And he discusses how tolerant the protocol is and how you can throw a bunch of things at it and it'll respond if you get it right. So that's, I guess, one of the things, if you're using this sort of application, you want to be kind of paying attention to the security attributes of it and make sure that it's doing as you'd intended for it to do and not other things.
Right.
That's one of the things that's easy to overlook in testing processes. The tendency is to test for the functionality to see if it does what you want it to do. The whole notion of security testing is trying to figure out what things it will do that you didn't intend for it to do, which is a much wider field of activities and often a challenge. Next item is top 10 most probed ports, and at the top of the list here we have port 135 TCP. We're going to take a little bit of a closer look at that. We haven't done that in a while. Followed by port 443 TCP. 443 has jumped up significantly in the rankings. It jumped up 11 slots to the #2 spot here. It turns out that was associated with the same university we were referring to earlier. It was just sort of a spike in activity, so perhaps innocuous. And then followed by port 22 TCP, port 23 TCP. This is scanning around for Internet of Things. Port 9064, which is a proxy application, 1900 UDP, that's associated with a simple service discovery protocol, often associated with reflection denial of service attacks, as is port 19 UDP, which is 2 slots down from that. We have port 445 TCP, followed by 53 UDP, again, often associated with reflection attacks, that is 53 UDP. And then last but not least, 3389 TCP, that's remote desktop protocol. As I said, looking at the scan probes on port 135 TCP, this is DC endpoint resolution associated with Microsoft applications. We're looking at 180 days of activity here. The probing activity is actually taking place from a US registered provider, but with Chinese registered addresses associated with it. So I think it actually physically is located in the United States, but it has some Chinese registration associated with it. I'm not sure exactly why that's the case, but when I dug around a little bit about that provider a little bit further, there are numerous forum postings describing spamming activities, mass spamming activities and nefarious activities such as that. So my guess is this activity is up to no good. Now, you really shouldn't have port 135 exposed to the internet anyway. No. So, I mean, there have been numerous issues associated with that in the past. And as Jim was pointing out earlier, we still have vulnerabilities in true type fonts and graphics formats. And so we shouldn't rule out the possibility of still having vulnerabilities in applications like this as well. So don't expose them unnecessarily. Next item here is the most sources doing the probing, and at the top of the list, port 23, which is that botnet activity scanning for the Internet of Things. This is the unmanaged Internet of Things, as we were talking about earlier, followed by port 445, and actually the rest of the ports here aren't even interesting, so I'm not going to bore you with it. We will take a little bit of a closer look at port 23 TCP, and we're actually in a little bit of a lull in terms of the number of sources doing the scanning. I wouldn't get too comfortable about that. We've had lulls like this before. For example, back in the third week of December, we saw a little bit of a lull. I think they were taking a break. Perhaps they are taking a little bit of a break again, or perhaps busy doing some other activities. And it is still on the order of 30 to 40,000 sources that we see, unique sources, in a given hour, which is on the order about the size of the Conficker scanning activity. So relatively speaking, this is not small. Some of the other activity where it was up around 150 plus thousand sources in a given hour, that was enormously large. And this is just looking at it from a the perspective of our analysis platform. It's not necessarily a full scope analysis. There may be quite a number of additional sources. So these botnets have been associated with denial of service attacks, and we would anticipate that that sort of activity will continue. So.